the conversation later. We're very happy to give a talk of this exhibition that I think every time that we talk about it, we try to make it differently. And that's what we did for today. And also, given that the show traveled after having been shot in Hong Kong in 2013, it went to Taipei, to a space called The Space, to Korea, to a national state center called Art Center, and then to the west coast of the US, or the Eastern Pacific coast in San Francisco, to the Kadist Foundation. And I think we are going to emphasize a little bit more towards mixing together the slides and our conversations on what we presented in Kadist and how that relates to perhaps a North American discussion. But in general, we'll introduce the project. So Cosmin, you can introduce.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Henry and Makiko and Jesse, for hosting us. It's really like a great pleasure. And as Inti said, indeed, for years, whenever we spoke about the exhibition, we really tried to make it different. But in the last few months, that was a very easy task. So I think it was really like the reality itself came back with a vengeance and made almost every aspect of what we were interested in with this exhibition more urgent and more present and taking a new form every day. So what we're going to do today is we're going to actually follow quite faithfully the method that the title of the exhibition points at. So the exhibition was called A Journal of the Plague Year for several reasons. And one of them was because we found the method that a journal normally implies particularly useful for the subject matter that we were interested in and the way we wanted to put it all together. Because a journal is a very particular document that lists events and facts and thoughts and reflections on developments in reality that primarily share the fact that they occur at the same time. Now, they might or might not be related, and very often they are, as life and reality often is, but it's not necessarily the main organizing or assembling argument, such as in the case of other forms of essays, which are usually group things that are connected to each other or they derive from each other. A journal, however, primarily organizes things that happen at the same time. Then, of course, the title itself, the original title that we borrowed or stole, is from an important book, a book that I think now in the last months many people have reread, so of Daniel Defoe. It was telling an eerily similar story to the one that we were telling, and it was the story of one of the many plague epidemics that hit Europe and in particular London in 1665. And we're going to talk later a little bit about like why this was like particularly connected. But first, I think the other reason why we also preferred this evocation of a historical book was because in order to tell a story of the present with the exhibition, we relied a lot on history. And the history of disease and in relation to Hong Kong is very long, and it basically starts from the beginning of the colonial experience in Hong Kong. Now, throughout the 19th century, there was a scientific debate going on in the Western world about the source of diseases. And it was a debate that was highly politicized. So in many ways similar to many discussions taking place today. So, both in the field of discussions about climate change, where different arguments, or, if you really can call the counter argument an actual argument, but where different positions are held alongside political lines. And also more recently in relation to the current COVID epidemics, how different positions about measures to be taken are also shared alongside political lines. So in the 19th century, there was a similar situation about how diseases spread. On one hand was the theory that proved to be embraced by the mainstream scientists of today, although now we realize that that's certainly not everyone, but the actual theory, the real one, of diseases being spread by agents, by biological agents, by bacteria or viruses or other forms as well in between individuals. And then a counter theory that thought that diseases are not spread by individuals, but that they are somehow intrinsic to a place, that a number of factors in a given location make that place and the air of that place bad, infected, contagious. This theory was known as the miasmatic theory, and because it was relying on these fictional, of course, miasmas, entities in the air of a place that were the vectors of disease. Now, by the end of the 19th century, the real method of transmitting disease was started to be embraced by most people. But what were the politics of it? Well, if you were to believe that diseases spread between individuals, and then you think that obviously they need to be controlled, how do you do that? You do that with quarantines. You do that with sanitation measures that cost money, but more importantly, they stop the economy from working. They are impediments to free trade. So if you stop people from, if you want to stop diseases from spreading, you have to stop people from circulating, and that, especially in the 19th century, stopped merchandise from circulating as well. So who was the biggest beneficiary of free trade in the 19th century? It was the British Empire. So the British Empire was the main supporter, and because of being the main beneficiary of promoting the miasmatic anti-theory. This was something that was a state project. The British Navy was very much involved in it. There are countless documents about how different strategies for supporting these ideas were implemented, from supporting doctors who believed in this theory to accede to certain posts, and most importantly, to create case studies. And Hong Kong was actually, for a very long time, and primarily for the first decades of its colonial experience, so after being occupied as a colony in 1841, so for the first primarily like 30, 40 years, there were various writings and studies done primarily by the British Navy about how Hong Kong is par excellence a place that is infected. It's something in its geography, something in its soil, something in the way the rays of the sun fall at particular angles, and also to like other fanciful ideas, make this a particularly dangerous place. Of course, race was always in the subtext. Of course, it was also a dangerous place and a dirty place, because this is the kind of like image that the racist perspective on the people of Asia was constructed, but it was rarely said directly, because that would have, at that time, impede the proper argument of how diseases spread outside of people, and they're somehow intrinsic to other geographical factors. So we're showing a few works that were included in the exhibition that sort of mark this history and are connected to actually other histories of representing disease, representing agents of infestation. So like Len Lai with his incredible pioneering animations from the 1920s. He was a New Zealand artist, or Irene Koppelman, who has this practice of quite faithfully trying to reproduce the language of scientific drawings and its strategy of representing diseases. Or Megan Cope, who is an Aboriginal Australian artist who studied a particular instance of how basically the same issues were negotiated in the process of the colonization of Australia by the British Empire. Now, this whole effort that I mentioned earlier of describing Hong Kong from the perspective of epidemics reached a moment of climax in 1894, where the last major epidemic of bubonic plague hit the world. And it very likely originated in China, in mainland China, but it particularly reached high epidemics levels in Hong Kong, and from there it actually spread to many places. It spread to the American West Coast. So in the case of California, it was actually one of the most devastating epidemics of the time. It spread to India, where actually by far the largest number of victims were registered. But Hong Kong plays a crucial role in these epidemics, both because it was the original point of a certain acceleration of contagion, but even more importantly, and you see images of well, basically the image that you see now is an image of the old Chinese neighborhood of Hong Kong. It's actually the neighborhood where Parasite was at the time we staged the exhibition for the first time. That was completely demolished after the bubonic plague. So that's another aspect that we touched a little bit in the project of how epidemics and the measures taken to contain epidemics had a major role in urban sanitation, but also in urban planning. So a crucial point of origin in modernist architecture and in modernist urbanism relies on the modern theories of epidemics and measures to be taken to contain them.
Also, just that to point out that the plague of the 19th century and how the British government reacted to it, it showed the colonial hierarchies and how the plague, though it was infecting British populations, it was concentrated, and the policies of hygienization were specified towards the neighborhoods that were the mostly Chinese populations in the colony. And that neighborhood that Cosmin was saying that was completely destroyed, the plague kind of was used in a way as well to basically demolish parts that the government had for years wanting to actually demolish.
I mean, as we see today, with the current epidemics, every epidemic, irrespective of its method of transmission, exposes social hierarchies, exposes class, and has a disproportionate impact on people of different classes. But it was even more particularly the case with the bubonic plague, because it was transmitted to fleas that were living on rats. So anyone who was privileged enough to have enough spaces to be far away from rats was significantly less likely to get it. But again, why was Hong Kong so important in the story of that epidemic of the bubonic plague was because these two doctors that you see in the picture actually discovered the bacillus, it's a type of bacteria that causes the plague in Hong Kong, in that neighborhood. You can imagine which one, the Japanese or the Swiss one, got the credit for this discovery. It was obviously the Swiss one, and the bacillus that causes the plague now bears his name in a Latinized form, so it's the Yersinus. And this was a huge news because the bubonic plague was not just one of many epidemics, but it was, and widely acknowledged and known at the time that it was one of the deadliest diseases in human history. And for the past millennium and a half, it had killed tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of people from Asia to Europe primarily. And in particularly in the 14th century, it killed possibly half of the population of Europe and also a significant number of people in China, at least. So this great killer, one of the greatest killers of humanity, had finally found its perpetrator. And the perpetrator was found in Asia, at the core of what was being regarded at the time as one of the most infected and epidemiologically dangerous Asian metropolises. And well, two footnotes here. The 14th century Black Death epidemics of bubonic plague, the deadliest of all of them in its history, very likely came again from Asia to Europe. And very likely the points of contact involved a Mongol siege of a Genoese city in Crimea called Kaffa. And the Mongol armies were surrounding the Genoese city, and the epidemics broke in the ranks of the armies, of the Mongol armies outside the city gates. And reportedly, the Mongol commanders employed the strategy of catapulting dead or ill bodies inside the city, spreading thus the disease to the Genoese inhabitants, who subsequently capitulated and were allowed to return back to Italy, taking the disease with them. And this is, of course, interesting because this can also then be for two reasons. One, because it shows again that very strong connection that was made in European imaginary between disease and contagion with Asia, and with an Eastern origin and with an Eastern danger in relation to epidemics, but also because this particular case was the first recorded biological warfare in history. And in the exhibition, we juxtapose that with a work of Taiwanese artist James T. Hong, who actually had several works in the exhibition. But one of them, yes.
Yeah, James has done both films and works such as his subjects related to his research on the Japanese atrocities that occurred throughout the Second World War. And this is, for example, shoes that were worn by a peasant who was infected during the chemical warfare that was carried out in Manchuria. This, for example, was shoes that were given by one of the peasants that he filmed while he was doing his documentary work. And we showed this next to the drawing that you just saw from the siege of Kappa to create that relationship of a weaponization of disease.
Another very short footnote that I'm just going to pass through is that that story of European free traders who tried to manipulate the understanding of how diseases spread, that the British Empire was the main proponent of, had another very striking example in the German city of Hamburg, which was also at the time one of the one built on commerce and on free trade, and was one of the richest cities in the world at the end of the 19th century. But because of a very well documented policy of its Senate, which was a very oligarchic one, it was an establishment of primarily of free traders, decided that the city will not implement any quarantine measure, any sort of sanitation that were at the time widespread in Europe. It had in 1892 one of the deadliest cholera epidemics in Europe at the time, when 10,000 people died, which was already by the end of the 19th century a huge number for a disease that by then was largely under control, and subsequent waves in Europe would perhaps only kill dozens of people. And again, cholera is a very interesting disease. It started spreading in Europe from the beginning of the 19th century. It also was seen as coming from an Eastern perspective. It was like less East Asian and much more associated with Russia and with the anti-Semitic horizon at the time. So Jews were seen as some of the main carriers of this disease. So there's a whole story and exhibition to be made on the history of cholera in the West. But that's not what we did. And
sorry.
And we were interested in the story of the bubonic plague and its discovery in Hong Kong. And we mentioned that this discovery was actually made, also like the work of the two doctors, and there were actually a few other doctors who were in Hong Kong and were trying to identify the disease. So it was happening in real time, in something that is somewhat comparable to the pace of scientific work that is happening now in the world, with trying to find a cure for COVID.
And also at that time, the telegraph played an important role of disseminating information. So you can imagine that at the moment when in Hong Kong, finally, these doctors, scientists found how was it transmitted, to the science behind it, it made world news. No, it was an almost lively announced through the telegraph, and it created this information and this immediate association of the plague coming from Hong Kong. Created even more associations of disease in relation to the Asian body. And this is what we related to the yellow peril. Yeah.
Yeah, and the yellow peril was at the time one of the, if not the most pronounced racist constructions and constructions of fear in the public discourse of the West at the time, and by the West including the British Empire with its colonies, so Canada, of course, Australia, South Africa, and the rest of Europe and the United States. And we a lot of this exhibition was built on the idea of fear and the crucial role that fear has in how we relate to disease, but also the crucial role that fear generally has in building societies, in building cultures that bound communities, how fear is a necessary agent for all sorts of like ideas to prevail, ideas that otherwise bring people together, you know, when faced with fear. So if you think of the white Western world at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, it's important to remember that in many ways it was a very similar world to ours. Just like our world, it had been at peace with itself for many, many decades, something that was quite unusual, you know, in the history of Europe, which was a particularly bloody and warfare one. But for many decades at the end of the 19th century, peace prevailed in Europe. A sense of technological progress was raising everybody's hopes that this will be a continuous one. An unprecedented level of interconnectedness of trade bound the European world. By certain measures, the level of international trade that was achieved in 1913, so the year before the First World War, was only achieved again in 1997 at global levels. So in this world of peace and progress inside the Western world, fear was still necessary in order to keep it together, as we said earlier. So where could that fear come from? Where could that horizon of threat be found if indeed, you know, all of Europe was so you know, joyfully at peace with itself? And Asia was actually the perfect candidate at the time. And this is basically how that construct of fear at the time and of racism that we know as Yellow Peril was largely based upon. And it was a complex that had several layers and several arguments. So on one hand, and this is, well, it's quite a later image that you find. So it's later, it's from the Second World War, but that's the natural culmination of the Western fear towards Japan, of a rising, wealthy and militarized empire. And on the other hand, there was the fear of the Chinese and of the great numbers, and in a way, the fear of what would happen with this decaying empire. So again, it was the whole Yellow Peril was a narrative that was powerful because it was so, that was taking into account the diversity actually of Asia as well. So that's why it's important to know that it wasn't based on a single stereotype, but it was based on multiple stereotypes and on a dynamic situation. And this is what made it so powerful and so pervasive. And Japan was a very important player in it. And an important moment was 1905, when Japan defeated Russia in a war that they were having together, a war that was also like hugely consequential for China as well, but more as a collateral damage. But this war was particularly important because it was the first time, essentially since the Mongol invasions that we mentioned earlier, that a non-white power defeats a European power at war. And this was seen as such by everyone. So the shock of this moment was humongous. Also considering that if we look at the colonial history of Europe, which obviously span half a millennium, but if we look at the developments in the last decade of the 19th century, so essentially in the 15 years preceding this defeat, you will see that large territories of Africa, of Southeast Asia, of the Pacific were actually conquered within those 15 years. So the fact that that process that was accelerating at the time was being actually reversed in East Asia by this growing non-white European power was a source of great distress in the West. And then, as I mentioned, the other component of Yellow Peril was the fear of the Chinese. And if we look at the actual discourses and phrases and imagery, we will see that this is eerily similar to many of the racist anti-Chinese discourses that are still in use. Some of them in relation to disease and epidemics, but not only. Things like fear of the numbers and of the sort of disproportionality in demographics. Fear like and constructions like the willingness to work for less money, the willingness to take the jobs and the situation where the Chinese take the jobs of white people were central to the anti-Chinese part of the Yellow Peril discourse at the time. Surely not through offshoring, but through immigration.
The cartoons and illustrations that you see here were part of the exhibition. They were present physically at close proximity with the photographs of the bubonic plague of Hong Kong. In a way, our association was on how those discourses, those medical discourses of fear towards contagion, translated to a cultural fear of contagion, of an otherness, of immigration, and how the Yellow Peril used hatred and the idea of projecting xenophobic representation of Chinese immigrants as being not only medically, physiologically unhygienic, but also morally unhygienic, that they were corrupt, not untrustworthy. And that became the scapegoat again for creating this fear within societies where there were Chinese communities, either in Australia, in California, in New Zealand, and in other contexts. And yeah, these are just some of the many. Perhaps people now in the chat are very familiar with some of these representations that really became iconic, and the archetypes that projected the xenophobia that that somehow it's re-emerging today.
I mean, you have a bat in this image, and then you have a wall in this image, so, you know.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of specificity to the West Coast in the US, this slogan, "The Chinese must go," was given by a politician in California at the time, and it became really the main characterization of the anti-Chinese sentiment, which actually in the 19th century built up a whole platform that later established the Chinese Exclusion Act in the Constitution, which is seen as the landmark law towards keeping the borders of border control. And it was that anti-Chinese sentiment which led to basically that fear of immigrants in general. But it started with the fear of the Chinese, the increasing amount of the Chinese population. You know? So what's important about this whole exhibition is that although we had this deep historical connections towards the past, we also wanted to see how artists, contemporary artists practicing in the past years have approached these thematics and these discourses, and how could we bring them into the conversation of the show. One of those artists that has done deep work on the Yellow Peril and how it not only occurred in the early 20th century, but somehow continued throughout the 20th century and throughout mass media in the US, through Hollywood specifically, is Ming Wang, an artist from Singapore who lives in Berlin, who has made several works on the subject in a way, but the most direct one is After Chinatown, or another piece called On Chinatown, in which he creates characters or reinterprets characters that appear in Polanski's film, where Jack Nicholson plays this detective that takes a case in which the background of Chinatown becomes this place of untrustworthy, corrupt, and morally unhygienic. And for the San Francisco Kadist presentation, we also presented the work of Newton Wang, who has made incredible work associating how all this xenophobia has also migrated to the gay community in the West, and how disgust and hatred towards male Asians in the mainstream gay industry and culture has created xenophobic structures and fears in the community. This is just, if you don't know the work, he appropriates different profiles of Asian Americans or Asians living in the US or Canada that go online, and they would mostly just show their torso, headless, or have, and he combines this portraits with the usernames that some of these online users take, playing around with both the Oriental fantasies or the self-exotization. No? And also because cartoons were such an important part of our research, we continued that with the help of the people in Kadist at that time, Marie and Shayu, who might be at the chat, they were instrumental as well to looking at how in San Francisco, within the communities of immigration, there was also satirical representation that somehow created a reflex of that conversation. So in the 1930s, Henry Kiyama made this manga series showing how the Japanese who migrated to California, or the middle-class Japanese who migrated there, confronted racism, thinking that they would be treated equally as a civilized society. And they encountered that they were actually, as this drawing suggests, that they were taken into quarantine once they entered the US to Angel Island, which is an important site of the history of immigration in the US, because that was the place where the Chinese immigrants would be registered. Some of them would be left there if papers were not unchecked. And this was a collaboration that we enabled for the exhibition, where Ming Wong, the artist that I just presented, together with Xiaoyu Wang, the curator who now works at Guggenheim, they made a text image-based work that was centered around photographs taken of the walls of Angel Island's quarantine, isolation, detention camps, where you could still see carved on the walls of these wooden houses the different inscriptions and texts by Chinese immigrants. Yeah. And as also part of the show in San Francisco, we had a series of photographs by the iconic photographer Dorothea Lange, who made a body of work based on the reaction that followed Pearl Harbor, the attack, and how that affected the Japanese American society in the US. And this is a photograph of a grocery store owned by a Japanese American business person who immediately after the attack in Pearl Harbor put up the sign showing a way that they were also American and that they were not Japanese. As you know, later on, the US decided to create concentration camps for the Japanese. And this is a very interesting conversation of what is happening today with how Asian Americans are now excluded from the national patriotic discourse of the US. No? And all of this very North American or American-centric conversations were very important, or Western production of otherness towards the Chinese and its fear for our exhibition, because the exhibition wanted to think of all that history of epidemics and all that history of hatred and fear and construction of disease in how immigrants were seen as infested or an agent that would infest a place, because at the time that we were making the show, it was very evident that in Hong Kong, that same language of fear and of xenophobia was being carried out towards the mainland Chinese in Hong Kong. And it's like, it's something that it's been somehow extremely connected to the years that followed the SARS epidemic, which is what we will talk about later on. But we are bringing here just another way of how the stereotype construction that the Hong Kong society builds upon towards the mainland Chinese constantly also uses a certain animalization of individuals. And this is a newspaper ad, full page, where mainland Chinese are portrayed as locusts. Locusts considered a plague that takes over all the resources of a place, or takes away all the crops of an area. This is an important metaphor or allegorical representation of fear and animalization to this discussion around the tensions that occurred between Hong Kong and mainland Chinese, because that was something that in the exhibition it resurfaced through other artists. One of those works that made somehow more news and had a lot of visibility was the work of Ai Weiwei, in which he took the subject of the milk formula, the baby milk formula, which is a produce that in Hong Kong is extremely associated to this tense relationship between mainland China and Hong Kong. Because by the time that we were making the exhibition, the government established a ban for mainland Chinese visitors to limit the amount of baby formula that they could buy. And this became like the main object of discussion and a fear of projection of the many amounts of the parents in mainland China that would, again, this construction that they would take over all the resources of milk formula of Hong Kong. And that's something that Ai Weiwei brought to the discussion by creating this huge map of China made with baby milk formula cans. And it was a very impressive installation, no? That had a direct relationship with something that was being discussed at that time. Of course, there wasn't a real data that showed that this would happen. It was clearly, again, this projection of fear around, again, the tense relationships that occur across the border. And the border is something that we also brought with the artist Samsung Young, who is an artist from Hong Kong, who did a very simple but poetic and strong work to try to connect to this very strange notion of the border, of course, that occurs between mainland China and Hong Kong. And he takes microphones of different kinds that can record in different climatic conditions and make somehow a composition that tries to represent through sound what he calls, through the title of his work, this liquid border. You know? And this animalization that I was speaking about is something that also was brought by artists like Inti Guerrero and James T. Hong from Taiwan, where they created a video in which ants that first they appear as microbiological imagery at the first stage of the video, they rapidly focused into the image of the ants that are devouring the map of the United States. They made this video when they were living in California, and they were very sensitive to how at that time it was very common to hear how Mexicans and Central American immigrants were portrayed by media because of the many amounts in work areas and in general throughout the state as ants that were reproducing and that they were taking over the country. You know? So they project again like this clear apocalyptic nightmare xenophobic projection in the film. And in Kadist, as part of the research, we also connected it to this book by Oscar Zeta Costa, who's a Chicano author, who appropriates this animalization of Chicanos, Mexican Americans, seen as cockroaches, and in a way that somehow, I guess, queer culture also appropriated a negative term. He self-identifies as a cockroach and creates a revolt. He speaks about the revolt of the cockroaches. Yeah, and this revolt is something that, or this shift of rebellion, no, is something that emerged in different parts of the show. So I think it was important for the exhibition as an experience that it was not only to construct a victimization of the Asian body, but moments in which those certain individuals or representations shifted and changed the structures of power. An iconic film that some of you that are in this chat might be very familiar with, called Chinese Connections in the 1970s, where Bruce Lee, Hong Kong actor, did this incredible act where he is not allowed to enter a social club because no Chinese nor dogs are allowed. And he gets completely mad and breaks at the end of the scene the sign on the gate. And another important factor of the exhibition was that we also wanted to create even or present more layers of exclusion that were happening and still happening in Hong Kong, so that it's not only about the relationship between, or the antagonisms between mainland China and Hong Kong, but how within Hong Kong society, there are other forms of othering, and there are other hierarchies that also project this fears of contagion and forms of exclusion. One of those presentations that we had was the cartoons by Larry Fine, political cartoonist here from Hong Kong, that since the late 70s has made different cartoons on issues in society in Hong Kong. And here you can see something related to the migrant domestic workers that in Hong Kong come from either Indonesia or the Philippines, and they are indeed a second-class immigrant in the Hong Kong society. And yeah, this cartoon shows very well how those acts of exclusion occur. Even this is in the 90s, but still till today. So
you know, I mentioned earlier of another reason why we particularly chose to refer to the original A Journal of the Plague Year book of Daniel Defoe. And that was because there's another uncanny resemblance, but it's more than a coincidence. And I think it's also relevant to understand the different economies of fear and what fear does to our world and to the dimensions of our world. So the book starts with a description of the mood in London, where there was an increasing fear because the war that was going on at the time, the Anglo-Dutch War, was not going well. So that the threat of somehow losing to the war with the Dutch at the time was. And the distant factor of fear was very much influencing the mood in London at the time. But then, as the disease starts to appear in the city and as it starts to engulf everybody's lives and conversation, the world becomes much smaller. That distant threat disappears. The London closes on itself. This is the only reality, and ultimately everyone's home and sort of self-isolated space becomes the tiny, tiny universe in which fear pushes their way. And this is a striking, there's striking connections to, well, in a way to our current experience, but particularly with the SARS moment, because March 2003, the month when SARS really emerged in Hong Kong and onto the world stage, was also the month when Iraq was invaded by America. And if you take the front page of a newspaper in Hong Kong, you can look at South China Morning Post. It's a good indicator for that. Essentially, every headline in the first days, well, we're not showing South China Morning because we're showing the time. But if you take for comparison, it's better because it's a daily newspaper. Almost every headline in the first days of March are about the latest antics in the Bush regime preparing themselves to invade Iraq. And then at some point, somewhere on the bottom of a page appears a story of this doctor who died of a strange pneumonia in a hospital in Hong Kong. And then within weeks, before the end of the month, before 1st of April, which is an important date, and we'll talk about it later, the first page changes completely. And even if Iraq actually gets invaded before the end of the month, that's hardly news in Hong Kong anymore, because all the news is focused on local news and particularly on the effects and the threat of SARS. So, you know, for just to understand a little bit, because we went through many stories and through many branches, but it was in particular that association between a fear of disease, a fear of the plague, and the fear of Asians at the time that happened at the end of the 19th century. And the way in which the imagery of fear and the vocabulary of fear of contagion shifted from biological agents to other people, that we were particularly interested, and we were particularly interested in how that was then employed and how that occurred in 2003, and how the overall impact of Horizon of Fear of SARS influenced other discourses in Hong Kong. And then, just like now, although quite differently, and that's a whole conversation about fear and capitalism and the stock market and credit and fear, trust and fear happens. But still, what happened during SARS was that the stock exchange and the real estate market in Hong Kong were in free fall. And the first measure taken by the government to try to alleviate that crisis was to allow citizens of mainland China to enter Hong Kong on individual visas for the first time. So even if the handover had happened 6 years prior to that, it was still very difficult for mainland citizens to enter Hong Kong. So you could only come in groups, in tourist groups, or with quite special visas for business or other purposes. So, I mean, even now, the travel is more difficult than, you know, in between many sovereign countries, actually, but still it's significantly easier than it was at the time to actually cross the border from the mainland side. From Hong Kong to the mainland, it was always easy.
Let's pass to this now.
Yeah, let's pass to this, okay. We don't have so much time. So I mentioned before 1st of April, which was a really important date in our diary, in our journal. That was, on one hand, it can be considered the height of the epidemic, of the SARS epidemic. The day started with rumors that there might be, that the World Health Organization might recommend essentially for the borders into out of Hong Kong to be closed. Something that at the time was seen as utterly dramatic, as an unprecedented measure. And, you know, whenever we gave this presentation prior to this year, this did seem indeed like something that would have been just a crazy fear that how could, you know, a major world metropolis be closed off from the rest of the world. And of course, now we are living this reality where all countries in the world essentially almost are closed off from each other. So we're certainly living much more extreme reality than what was being rumored in the early hours of the 1st of April 2003 in Hong Kong. So that actually didn't even happen at the time. What did happen as well in that day was that Leslie Cheung committed suicide in a tragic and dramatic fashion by throwing himself from the top of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, which is actually quite an iconic institution in Hong Kong, and it's also in the center of the city. So there's hardly a more dramatic way to commit suicide than that. Now, for the ones who might not know of Leslie Cheung, it's also very difficult to overstate his importance for Hong Kong identity, and I think more broadly for Asian popular culture. He was a singer primarily, and I think primarily in Asia, he's more well known as a singer, or well, no, primarily outside of Asia, he's more known as an actor than a singer. But yeah, in Asia, he was one of the first, or the first really youthful popular star that became popular and adored throughout Asia that was Asian. So the first figure that was not a national figure, part of a national pop stage, or a Western star, or some of the more of the sort of like less trendy figures like Teresa Teng, or less you know, likely to be considered part of youth popular culture of the time. So Leslie Cheung was really that figure, the first figure that prompted a sense of popular culture being able to be shared on a continental level and being free from Western influence or being driven by Western stars. But he was also more than that, because he, as a star from Hong Kong, he was, you know, speaking and singing in Cantonese, and he was really the king of a wave of popular culture that came from Hong Kong from the 70s and 80s that was that had a huge role to play in the formation of a Hong Kong identity. And, you know, we were speculating this a little bit, that if we look at how nations are formed and that romantic history of building a national culture that throughout the 19th and early 20th century formed the basis of most nations, whether independent or not in the world, and largely drawing from ancient folklore. In the case of Hong Kong, and again, that's a long discussion to what extent Hong Kong can be called a nation, and, you know, whether we like it or not, or endorse it or not, in many ways, it got to the point where it, you know, a large number of people imagine itself to be one. And if that nation is to be regarded as such, it largely relies not on ancient folklore, but on that popular culture, on canto pop of the 70s and 80s. And in that formation, in that, you know, modern folklore, Leslie Cheung is really the king in many ways. He's the one who led it. And again,
his nickname is very telling.
Yeah, so Big Brother in Cantonese. And of course, again, for Asia itself, I mean, he's really the precursor of all the waves that that came afterwards, and the K-pop, the Korean pop wave that is now in so many ways defining popular culture and self-identification throughout Asia. And again, he was a great pioneer in that. Moreover, as an actor, he might be known better for some of you because he played in two of Wong Kar-wai's films, including Happy Together, and which was very successful globally, and I think in many ways marked a whole generation of people. But he also played in Farewell My Concubine, which is in many ways one of the most successful Chinese language films of all times. And that is particularly interesting, I think, for our story, because it was filmed in 1993 and it got the award in Cannes in 1994, so just before the handover. I think in many ways this can be regarded as a pop cultural precursor to that moment of handover, you know, and in a way, those years leading to the handover, and particularly before 1989 and 1997, were years where a certain potential of genuinely coming together of whatever Hong Kong represented and you know, the culture of the mainland was at a much more utopian phase than it proved to be afterwards. And that great coming together on a cultural and identitarian level that, you know, for better or worse, sadly or not, it never actually came to be afterwards, was more able to be imagined at the time. And the film itself is quite incredible because on one hand you have this star, you know, and again, if you think of the early 90s, this Cantonese speaking star, and if you think of like the early 90s, you know, Hong Kong was still seen as a very glamorous and richer part of the Chinese-speaking world than the mainland. Of course, this distinction is largely gone now, but at the time it still made, you know, it still had a basis in reality. So on one hand, to have this glamorous star to, you know, be in this process of homecoming, to play in a Mandarin-speaking film, in a you know, great story that touched that nervous, you know, that very loaded moment of history in China, the mid-20th century, and through this great cultural form of Chinese opera. So it's very difficult, again, to overstate the symbolics that were at play in that film, in the fact that he played in the film and it got an award. So I'm mentioning all that just to sort of understand the incredible weight that was attached to this figure. So to have this figure that was, you know, larger than life, dying in that particular manner, in that particular place, at that particular time, was absolutely surreal. And I think in many ways, the heaviness of the SARS crisis and the heaviness of Leslie Cheung's loss at the time largely influenced each other and sort of like projected, mutually projected to be for both events to be even larger than they actually were. And several things happened. For his funeral that happened later in April, a large number of people decided to turn up. I think the politics of distancing versus non-distancing at the time were slightly different than they are now, and I think there was more of a, I mean, obviously there was a great deal of responsibility in Hong Kong, but there was also, I think, less stigma associated with actually taking the decision to break the quarantine and showing up together. Because
it might also because now I'm just thinking that it's also because if you compare the coronaviruses, the SARS and COVID-19, although SARS is actually more lethal, or let's say there's more deaths in relation to the amount of people infected. However, the velocity of infection of COVID-19 is much faster, and so the idea of being together was also not as strict as is nowadays with COVID. Anyway,
yeah, it was slightly less dangerous and it was less likely to get SARS from being close to another person than, and more importantly, you wouldn't get SARS from an asymptomatic person. So if you were with a mask next to a person who didn't show any symptoms, then you were very unlikely to actually get SARS. So what happened was that tens of thousands of people showed up for his funeral, which actually happened next to where Parasite is located at the moment, for the funeral home, so really the neighboring building.
Also, within the exhibition, how this story of Leslie Cheung was represented, there were different ways, but one of them was through this shrine that we created by doing an open call wherever the exhibition happened, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Korea, and even in California, where different fans of Leslie Cheung were asked to bring their own collections or parts of their collections. It was a very interesting experience curatorially, because we asked every single owner of these objects to come and install. And so it was really a kind of a shrine. And at the time that we made the exhibition in Hong Kong, it was 10 years after SARS, therefore 10 years after Leslie's death. And so there were official commemorations, but maybe extremely commercial. And somehow this shrine created a more vernacular, grassrooted way to create some kind of commemoration and memorialization.
But then something else happened. So another important element of the journal was that, and this is really, even more eerily similar to what is happening at this very moment, but during the SARS crisis, the Hong Kong government was trying to essentially profit from the fact that everybody was busy staying alive, and they tried to pass the very controversial security law that was being mandated in the Hong Kong's basic law to be passed at some point by the Hong Kong government. That was a miscalculation. People were actually paying attention, and there was this paradoxical reaction to quarantine, to self-isolation, to being, isolated from the others, and from, sensing that there was a danger from coming together and with other people. And people did come out together first for Leslie Cheung's funeral, but then weeks after they came out to protest this national security law that was being attempted to be passed. And this led to the largest demonstrations in Hong Kong history up until that point. And it culminated with the 1st of July, that's also the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to mainland China. So it culminated with a march of 500,000 people, which was a huge number at the time, and obviously a huge number for the population of Hong Kong. So it was around 10% of the population of that year. So this, at the time, had managed to stop the law. So the law was shelved, it didn't pass. And it had more broad consequences on Hong Kong history, because this led to the pro-democracy march becoming an annual event. So on 1st of July, regularly hundreds of thousands of people march as a sort of reminder for democracy in the first years. But then it led to increasingly intense manifestations. It led to the umbrella movement of 2014. It led to last year's even bigger protests, and with larger number of people showing up. And it also led to this image that maybe you want to continue.
This just happened yesterday. Basically, there was a specific debate happening in the Legislative Council in Hong Kong yesterday related to a law to pass called the National Anthem Law, basically towards building legislation where in the future, if anyone would disgrace the national anthem or the flag, would be imprisoned or will be processed. And obviously this was the context of yesterday, but this is in general within the larger context of the security law that the Communist Party in Beijing is starting to write at this moment, which is the same security law that in 2003 people rebelled against, but now they remerged the conversation in a moment where, because of the epidemic, it is officially illegal to congregate in public in groups that exceed 8 people. And so a lot of people were arrested yesterday, around 400 people, right? In a combination of rioting and also because of violation of the current laws of social distancing. And it's somehow what we just for.
But I think it's important to mention that the situation is actually different. That there is this analogy of the same or a law with similar object of interest trying to be passed in the midst of a coronavirus epidemic. It is very different because in this case it's not anymore following the basic laws mandate for the Hong Kong government to pass such a law. So in this case, it was the central government who decided to bypass that and to pass it, above the Hong Kong government and without any debate in the city. So that's the situation now, and of course it's very emotional and dangerous and momentous in many ways. So what we try to do with the show, and always being aware of this lived-in history in which all the stories that we were telling were finding themselves, but we also try to complicate the reality by pointing out the fact that these two separate but nevertheless overlapping stories that marked Hong Kong's history post-2003. On one hand, the pro-democracy movement in its various iterations. On the other hand, the increasingly complicated relationship between Hong Kongers and mainland Chinese that was also increasingly marked by instances of xenophobia on the part of Hong Kongers towards mainland Chinese and different forms of racist projections. So how these two stories that again are separate, but there's obvious moments of overlap, do share the same moment of origin. And they can each trace their history in the developments of spring of 2003. So that was, I think, yet another important point that we tried to make with the exhibition.
And a way that we wanted to bring into the exhibition space the subject of this July 1st March and the democracy movement in Hong Kong was through the work of Pak Sun-shin, who's a Hong Kong artist that devoted since 2003 a lot of his practice towards trying to create a relationship of how can art play a role within this social collective manifestation. And this is a piece that he did both as a street action and later translated into a newspaper work. He had access at that time to a newspaper in Hong Kong. And what you see to the left is an image of a photograph where he places a yellow piece of cloth in which marchers of the July 1st protests cross through it, stepping to the cloth, leaving the imprint of their passage. And he later takes out that piece of cloth and he cuts in different pieces and travels to Beijing and lays out around the Forbidden City this imprint, this memory of the July 1st marches from Hong Kong. So it's, as its title says, it's a present to the central government. And this is another work that he later did that became kind of a ritual to do every year, where he would take a photograph. He would take a newspaper of July 2, so the day after the July 1st march, and he would take a photograph of that day and juxtapose his image, basically thinking on what is the horizon of the days after or the years after when people march. I think that has shifted a lot, because somehow at that time when he did that work in 2004, there was some kind of critique from him saying that it was only at that time of the year where this pro-democracy marches happen. But nowadays it's happening every weekend in some form or another. So the show, wanted to bring this street and collective body in another form, so not maybe so direct or not specified to 2003, but to create different allegories of how society and protest and the city of Hong Kong could be brought into the discussion for the show. And reenactment of a seminal performance piece by Ligia Pape, a Brazilian artist who in 1968, during the time of the dictatorship in Brazil, created a performance piece where a huge piece of cloth called the divisor, or the divider, created a symbolic act to show how societies work, both that they have to work collectively, but they're also individuals are distant from each other and fear from one another. No? And this performance work was something that, and the presence of performance was something that was very important for us throughout the show, almost like a complete different section in a way to even reshuffle the experience of the exhibition. Of course, we're presenting a slideshow here, and the show, how it was experienced bodily, temporarily, has a different form. But it's important to make this emphasis on how at certain point of the show, people entered this room in which bodies rebelled through performance on trying to create some kind of counterpoints to all these structures of power that we've described so far. This is, for example, a work by Ricky Young, and this is already the end section of our presentation, where he, in the 1980s, as an immediate reaction to the agreement that Margaret Thatcher in '84 had made with the Chinese Communist Party to reaffirm that by 1997 they would return back Hong Kong to the mainland, as a reaction of all of this social, of this discussion in society. The artist made a performance piece where he staged his own body as a beast, as an animal chained inside a cage, a bamboo cage, as a clear allegory towards how Hong Kongers were being treated in this agreement, where they were being passed from master to master. No? Ma Liu-ming, an important and iconic artist of contemporary art history in China, of an important moment and decade in Beijing, was also present, where there was some kind of rebellious body that was clear in his actions at that time. Or Mossad, an artist from Burma, who is part of a generation that started to create critical work during the last decades of the military regime in Burma. And something that is more related to North America, and that we presented in Kadist, is the performances of the Chicano collective called ASCO. Asco in Spanish means disgust or filth. So there's also like this self identity process of using pejorative stereotype towards their own practice and representation. So ASCO, this collective of Chicano, Mexican-American artists that in the 70s did several street performances, and here one of them where they have lunch, wearing all the Dia de los Muertos makeup. And they made it on a street that has an important symbolic value of memory of the Chicano movement of the 60s, when the riots of Chicanos in LA were taken down by the police, and there was a lot of deaths and killings. Protests of the Chicano civil rights movement happened because a lot of Chicanos, like African Americans, were sent to war on the front lines, and they were dying before the white soldiers in the Vietnam War, for example. So this is just an image again on how these generations of immigrants were seen as second-class citizens. They were animalized, they were medicalized, they were isolated through the urban planning of LA, and they start to rebel in the 70s by creating these actions. No? And yeah, just towards the end, because when we were in San Francisco, we wanted to also relate, when we did the show in San Francisco, we did want to relate to the art community there, and specifically how certain individuals did certain type of work that we wanted to associate with AIDS. We somehow did not, we took out the, there isn't a chapter of AIDS because it has a different way of how society related globally to that pandemic. But we did find that there were moments in the exhibition that would be possible to associate the plagues of the 19th century with certain practices that represented AIDS in a way that connected those things. So, however, again, this is something that we could talk about it maybe in the chat. Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's basically towards the end. And we
we went over time.
Yes, apologies. This is just an image that it somehow made it through the exhibition in Kadist. At that time when we made the show, there was the Ebola pandemic at the time. It didn't spread as COVID-19, but it was definitely in the horizon of media. And throughout Africa, in West Africa, there was a lot of xenophobia against West Africans. And that was carried out in similar ways as how we describe like Yellow Pearl, but within their own forms of representation and media and ways in which West Africans were perceived at that specific time of the Ebola threat. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you both so much. Thank you both so much.
We really went overboard.
Well, there's so much. There's so, this show has so many rich histories and so many powerful artworks that, need some time to be able to breathe, right? So I really appreciated you guys unpacking the complexities of this project. And while we're waiting for some comments and questions to come in, one of the things that I was thinking about a lot when you were talking about the exhibition was I was trying to imagine how it was laid out in the spaces in which it was held. Because of course, it's getting more and more difficult for us to think about what it's like to be in a space looking at art in a phenomenological way. But I know that you guys took great care with this exhibition. And, I really liked the Leslie Cheung memorial piece and Ai Weiwei's piece, the way it was lit. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your curatorial strategies around moving through the space, whether or not you had narratives that were based on chronology or based on conceptual associations or aesthetic links, or what were some of your ideas around that? And maybe if you could just, articulate that experience a little bit for us.
Yeah, it's a good question, because basically both Parasite Space and the Cube in Taipei, where the exhibition went, were very, very small spaces. Arca Museum in Seoul was, a large space, and San Francisco was mixed, because also Kadist space is quite small, so a lot of the exhibition that was there was also quite concentrated, although the lab is also like quite spacious. So yes, it would have been a completely unsafe show in an era of pandemics, because it was very concentrated. And we amplified it to some extent. I mean, we had to create narrow spaces to fit all these stories, but we even did it on purpose. So at some point when we really wanted you to confront something, we even narrowed down the corridor even further. So, when you were at some point, seeing all those images of stereotyping and of caricaturing and reducing people to their abstraction, we wanted you to be very close to those images and not to really have a space to move away from them, because you were essentially surrounded by walls showing equally powerful images. But yes, what Inti mentioned earlier, that part of the decision to include these performative practices and these fragile bodies, primarily male bodies, because it was very much it was also very much in relation to the body of Leslie Cheung. So there was a particular reason to bring this type of like gendered body in the conversation. But the decision to include it was very much based on the spatial experience, because even now we told the story and this was seemed as an afterthought, because in the kind of chronological narrative of events, this is a different component. But in the show, these were actually moments of rupturing, of destabilizing chronological or any other form of narratives that were based on a cause and effect relationship between elements of some sort. So you would enter the show, you would see some, you would be told some stories at some point, but then you would move into a completely different type of experience, into a different, completely different type of relating to the object in front of you. You weren't, we purposefully didn't want this to be pedagogical throughout the show. And if that might have happened with some objects, then very soon after you would encounter a different object or a different association of objects that would do something really different to you and would trigger a different type of viewing experience from you. And you were meant to be destabilized. You were meant to stop the learning mode and try to, and you would ask questions. You suddenly didn't know what you were seeing. You suddenly didn't know what was actually happening. And I think that's the power of exhibition making. And this is why there is a particular way to create experiences and to organize knowledge within an exhibition that, no other tool for knowledge has. Because journalistic writing or academic writing works with a very different logics, or cinema works with a very different logics. And I think analogously to that, exhibition making and curatorship have their own power to say things, to expose things that we otherwise wouldn't have the tools to see them or to perceive them. There's many things we didn't show, but again, something that I think it's quite striking now, that one of the first things you actually saw in I think most venues was actually this fragment of Vanilla Sky. It was a film that had well, also this one says like that, the Pennies of Firenze Live. But then there's this scene in Vanilla Sky, a film with Tom Cruise, and the scene is you basically see Tom Cruise waking up and going about a normal day in New York and getting to Times Square and realizing there's nobody around, the city is empty, and then having this utter meltdown of realizing that the time has stopped, the great metropolis and capitalism has stopped, and nobody's around. And again, we introduced it because it seemed an apt metaphor for Hong Kong during SARS, but it was a bit far-fetched. It wasn't, what was, the city still continued. The great wheels of capitalism never really stopped. And they didn't stop now either, but this image is much more potent in today's COVID-19 reality. And, if we think of how so much of how we perceive the world is informed by how the great agents of popular culture organize it for us and narrate it for us. And Hollywood is obviously a major player into this. We see how we're living and we're seeing the situation in a particular way because we were, already taught to see it in that way. And this is a great example. And then we actually showed several fragments from Contagion, the film, which is another document that now became, again, widely revisited by people because it says so much about how we see the world, not because they had a great power of anticipation, but because they had a great power of creating the tools that were already there, and we just took them now to understand what has been happening, what is happening to us now.
I think also a combination of medium and a multiplicity of medium that was juxtaposed in one same wall. It's something that characterized somehow the experience of going through the exhibition. So that excerpt that Cosmin was talking about, Vanilla Sky, was shown in a very small screen that was embedded in the wall, on a wall that was primarily showing paintings of a Hong Kong artist called Firenze Lai, who clearly translate through the language of painting a psychological fear and how individuals isolate and the tensions that occur between the outside and the inside, the outdoors and the indoors. She is an artist that, well, she was very young when SARS happened. So there were moments in which we approached certain artists that they not necessarily made work on SARS or on the pandemics, but that their aesthetic language was a form that revealed discussions, for example, in the case of Fear and Sly, on how could we translate through a language of art these feelings of fear, yeah, and that's one of the many examples that it happened, yeah. Just to give, yeah, and in every single venue the dimensions varied, as Cosmin said, because of the different spaces. We took different decisions. And at Parasite, for example, and something that audience remembered at the time in relation to the Len Lai, we presented the Len Lai actually as a very small projection. So it really looked like this strange viral presence within the walls of the exhibition. Yeah. But in Korea, it was projected in a large screen, or the map that of the ants devouring the map of the US. Also, when it traveled to Korea, it was shown in a larger projection, so you really felt invaded by these animals. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. I noticed that there's a couple questions coming in, or at least one here. Alice Jim, hi Alice, nice to hear from you. So she's asking, did you feel any sense of catharsis by visitors as part of their experiences?
Actually, yes. I mean, it's a bit hard to speak about that, you know, because it's so, yeah, in other words, so personal, I think, for certain people. There were quite a few. The show, so also like speaking on the architecture, so at Parasite, it was basically like a spiral, like a conch. So you would, you know, start on these corridors, and then you would end up in the middle of the space, but the middle of the space being a small room, where we made it as a karaoke room, where we actually projected the film of Liquid, a film that he made for the show, and it was with a song of Leslie, and there were the vitrine, the sort of like shrine of Leslie was in that room, and a couple of other items. But it was a karaoke room with sort of like that light, and we had like some LED lights and the couch and a microphone. You could actually like sing along to Liquid's room. So we had quite a number of people who just, you know, at the end of the show, just, you know, stayed there and, you know, cried, or, you know, wanted to talk to each other, or there were quite a few such reactions. And I think the show hit a nerve in the city as well. It got a massive coverage, and, you know, we're very humbled that a lot of it was not the sort of like the regular kind of reviews that, you know, sadly happens often these days, of, you know, just a press release being rehashed. But I think a lot of people sort of like engaged with it in different ways. There was a bit almost coincident. We didn't actually plan this to be an anniversary show. You know, we have proof that we were actually like planning to do it in, you know, the autumn of 2012. But then, you know, for other pragmatic reasons, it just got pushed to 2013. So it actually coincided with the moment of anniversary. So it opened just after I think it opened in May. So just after 1st of April, and towards the end of the sort of 10-year anniversary of the SARS crisis. But yes, it also then played into that, the conversations that were taking place at the time, and the reevaluations, and how different people were assessing the consequences, the long-lasting consequences of that year, you know, both historically and for themselves personally. So yeah, I think quite a few people had a sense of catharsis. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for us as well, it was also, I think, quite a very important show, and it certainly shaped our, you know, relationship to our home. I mean, we were quite recent migrants to Hong Kong when we opened the show, but you know, many years have passed. So it certainly played an important role in that both intellectual and affective relationship to our adopted home.
I think in relation to that, how the process happened, because precisely we are not from here, and we started to do this research. Part of the research was actually interviewing a lot of people who did live through SARS, not only people in the arts, but also journalists, for example, that we, and people from literature, where we recorded some of these interviews, and some of these interviews were part of the show. So there were voices within the experience of the exhibition, just like a bit of information booth, but placed in a nice way, that narrated firsthand chronicle, you know, as part of this Journal of the Plague Year. Yeah. There's a question here from So Ying Lee. Hi, Cosmin in India. I'm wondering if you did some research into the invention of the branch of medicine called tropical medicine and its relationship to colonialism and the dispossession of lands.
A little bit. I mean, we were, you know, we obviously never really claimed to be, you know, real experts on medicine or its history. Some of the what we said at the beginning, so some of that, some of those conversations on the history of disease and how diseases spread, and in particular how the British Navy was an important agent in making the case for the miasmatic theory throughout the 19th century, and you know, to fight against quarantines and to sort of like enhance free trade, and it was only possible because of colonial dispossession of the world. So obviously free trade was colonial trade. There was no, that's what it was. So these are important parts of that. There's certainly way more there, and you know, if one really wanted to tell these stories from the perspective of to actually tell a story of the 19th century and how epidemics were read and regarded and instrumentalized, then obviously one would have to look at its tropical medicine and you know, how it was a crucial weapon in the colonial experience.
There was one small, I mean, it was just a small presence that could be part of that, but there was an archival film from the War Museum that we included in the show, that was the vaccination of Hong Kongers, and specifically mostly the Chinese citizens of Hong Kong in the 40s, I believe.
No,
earlier,
much earlier.
20s. An archival film that shows all, the vaccination. It's an interesting footage because it not only shows people getting the shots, but also right after there's footage of informal vendors with tropical fruit being taken out of the street. And there's this strange association in the footage of seeing this as maybe a source of disease. Yeah.
Yeah, we also briefly showed the work of Megan Cope from Australia that was more specifically linking disease and how that was instrumentalized colonially and actual land dispossession of Aboriginal people in Australia. Yeah, so it's certainly a valid direction to be followed, particularly if the story would be told more broadly, you know, connecting colonial experience in general and disease in the same time period. Hong Kong is, of course, also a very particular place, also from how the colonial experience, how the colonial exploitation and how the colonial economy was organized around it. And it was quite an atypical colony, but it was so much based on you know, being this huge entrepot and commercial hub that the kind of like large-scale dispossession of lands that happened in most of the other colonies happened very differently in Hong Kong, and sort of that object of exploitation was a different one. So yeah, and then there was a question before. Hello, I'm just wondering about your process of collaboration with the various artists in the shows. Besides the shrine, were there any works commissioned specifically for the show, or how did these works come to amass?
Yeah, the Ai Weiwei was a commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, just maybe just briefly that the Ai Weiwei piece that we presented was a commission, actually a self-commission. There's a bit of an anecdote there because Cosmin was working before in the touring of another exhibition from Parasite that was about Teshin Xie, Ai Weiwei, and Frog King and Martin Wong, Chinese American art history in relation to New York in the 80s. And as part of a visit to Beijing, when Cosmin was visiting Ai Weiwei for that, casually he talked about the current research of the plague show. And he said immediately, "Oh, I want to make I have a work.
I want to be in the show.
I want to be in the show." And so he immediately associated something that was happening in the news because, well, as you know, most of the current practice of Ai Weiwei is news responsive or moment responsive. And so at that time, as we said, there was this whole discussion also in the mainland around the milk baby formula brought from Hong Kong. It's a discussion that happens within dissidents in the mainland and netizens, because the reason why mainland visitors or business men and women bring baby formula from Hong Kong is because there was an accident in China where a company that was producing baby milk formula in the mainland poisoned a large population of children, of babies, and that led to people who had access to imported baby milk formula started to bring more of it, either through their travels or through merchants. And so this is something that Ai Weiwei at the moment was really wanting to talk about, and it made total sense for the exhibition.
Yeah. There were a few others. So Likit mentioned briefly made a particular work for the show. So that a video, like a karaoke video based on a song by Leslie Cheung, and the karaoke room was that. It was also part of the work, actually. And also Ming Wong, some of the works were actually like done for the show. I mean, some of them were works that he was thinking about, some of them like the one with Xiao Yu were actually like new works altogether. But the Chinatown, the film was also like made for the show.
No. He had made it before in California.
TV, sorry.
Yes. I think that the form of presenting one of the videos was definitely like imagine.
Yeah, and the Angel Island is something that I think they did together with Xiaoyu, and then they went to the island, Xiaoyu wrote the text, there was this whole conversation. So it was a mix, but yes, the majority of the works were existing works. And it's a very good question, because indeed there was this conversation. I mean, in some cases there were, you know, works that directly dealt with the subject, so it was a pretty straightforward conversation about wanting to include them there. But in other cases, there was certainly a longer conversation we had to have as curators of, you know, why we want to include their work that might have been created in a particular context in the, you know, in some cases different contexts that we're creating with our show. So that was quite interesting, actually, in several cases.
Yeah, but as more than the commissions, maybe personally I found interesting within the process was to create some kind of archaeology of practice and work by artists and theater groups and exhibitions that happened in that year of 2003 that somehow were produced almost responding or as a consequence of the moment, and that in recent history they had been forgotten or they hadn't been reframed within the context of an exhibition that was looking back at SARS. Because of course, when an epidemic or such an important moment in society happens, only with historical distance will we ever understand the real cultural consequences and political consequence of that moment. That's why it's so interesting, or it's very different nowadays with Zoom and with the liveness and blogs and media and Twitter, that people immediately historicize in a way. But we try to, there's all this debates online on like, let's try to understand the art world in COVID-19, but it's a pandemic. Like, we don't know, we need some historical time to really understand what is this moment that we are passing through, no? And one of the works that we encounter in this research was the work of Park Sun-shin that we've mentioned before, who did a lot of work in that year. And this is one of them, which is quite brilliant. In Hong Kong, since SARS, it's very common for elevators to in housing estates and at offices to have a sheet of plastic that would be easier to clean and hygienize every hour or every two. And the artist took one of these plastic sheets from the building of his apartment, in which, because of the continuous pressing of the security code to enter the building, the sheet had created a relief, or a counter relief, I don't know how you call it. Yeah, a relief of the buttons of the security code. No, so a very interesting also metaphor of what does it mean to feel safe and secure at the time, etc. Or the catalog that you see here to the right. I forgot to put the caption there. Apologies. It's the catalog of what was meant to be the first pavilion of China in the Venice Biennial. It was going to happen in 2003. This is the moment of major transformation in Chinese economy and diplomacy, very like gearing towards the Olympics, etc. And the pavilion was an important moment of contemporary art and its internationalization, Chinese contemporary art. And it didn't happen because out of fears of the Italian organizers, they banned not only the pavilion to happen, but for any participant to fly to Venice. Yeah.
Which again, that sounds like, you know, as you know, day-to-day business these days. But again, this was actually extraordinary at the time, and it's something that, you know, prior to this year, again, had never otherwise happened. Okay, so there's another question. So hi, Cosmin, you briefly mentioned how you've integrated the AIDS crisis with the concept of the exhibition, and was it just in the San Francisco presentation? So I think it's important to mention that we actually, I think we weren't so clear here, that we actually made a conscious decision not to engage with the AIDS crisis for the show for several reasons. One of them was that we felt that the incredible history of activism and of artistic practice produced in the context of AIDS is such a monument that is in a completely different scale than whatever was being produced or discussed in the context of airborne epidemics, in the context of SARS in Hong Kong and its implications, that any intersection would have been disbalanced, or it might have seemed perfunctory or inappropriate. But then there was another reason for it, which was because the exhibition was primarily negotiated from the perspective of fear and the politics of fear. And in spite certain overlaps, there is a fundamental difference in the politics of fear surrounding AIDS and the one surrounding airborne diseases, because ultimately, you know, the fear of other people and the fear of approaching other people and getting the disease from other people is a legitimate fear in the case of airborne diseases. But it's, the very core of AIDS activism is to prove the illegitimacy of the fear of other people, of approaching, of you know, being intimate with another person in the context of AIDS crisis. So I think this fundamental difference made it, was another argument why we chose not to bring in that conversation here. When we did take the exhibition to San Francisco, you know, somehow the obvious weight of the AIDS history in the context of San Francisco made us take the decision in a way to include this explanation in the show, you know, to acknowledge the absence of the AIDS history, you know, more clearly than we did it before. I mean, we only did it, you know, in our public presentation, but it wasn't really part of conversations or the actual exhibition in the other cities. So basically, the performance in the poem of Kevin Killian, who sadly passed away recently, which was not about the AIDS crisis. It was a poem that was, Inti can say more about it, but it was a poem that was written more than half a century ago in Berkeley, but, you know, was then very much used and had a particular history of reappropriation in the context of AIDS activism. And then we also, as we show different other fragments of films, of cinema, of popular culture, we also took that fragment from Angels in America, where the main character encounters his ancestors who died of other plagues, not of the AIDS. And
one died of the bubonic plague.
One died of bubonic plague, yeah, in the 14th century, and another one actually died in 1665 in London. So during the yes, plague mentioned in the Journal of the Plague Year in Daniel Defoe's book. So there were basically these two indirect references to the AIDS crisis as a way to acknowledge the absence and our decision to not engage with that history and with that heritage.
Last question. No, I noticed that there you mentioned a few women from Hong Kong. I'm wondering that they shied away from, or so why do you think this is so?
Well, Firenze Lai is a female artist. Yeah, I think that in that regard with the Hong Kong artist, I think there's a combination, yeah.
I think it was very obvious when we were in Korea that definitely, because Korea was the one that had the most sort of divergent chapter that we didn't even like talk about.
And we won't, don't worry, Jess.
And we won't, yeah. It's not an intro to that. But it was quite obvious because, you know, I think most of the works looking into Korean history of disease and fear, and also like how that sort of like bled into the very particular Korean fear of communist contagion coming from the north was done primarily by women artists. So I think there was this realization how there's less of women artist voices in Hong Kong. The show definitely had less women artists than we normally practice. So I think it was definitely built in that way. And partially it was more, you know, because of this chapter that sort of like looked at the male body and had all these like male performance artists that were in one way or another sort of meant to refer to Leslie Cheung's body. Not sure if that was necessarily the only way to do it. It was definitely it was kind of like the decision we took at the time. We probably would do it differently now. And that whole chapter of performance and how to perhaps it would have been better to actually destabilize that body by bringing in more dissident bodies and different bodies as well.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your wonderful talk and your awesome responses. I think we're going to have to, I don't know, there's one more question. Let's ask, can you guys answer this last question, and then that'll be the last one.
So the question is, thanks so much for the presentation. Wanted to ask more about the relationship between the exhibition and COVID-19 in light of the current pandemic. Do you think that the exhibition speaks for itself more powerfully than ever, or has the scale and presence and urgency of what's happening thrown any of your ideas into question in unexpected ways?
Good wrap-up question.
It's a great question. They were all great questions. Well, I think it certainly brought the necessary humbling realization that, you know, ultimately any exhibition, I would say, is such a minor exercise in the face of history and reality unfolding with its powers. So there is that sense of again, realizing the limitations of our field. There are several things that also, like the things that we mentioned, that were destabilized because we certainly, you know, certain things that seemed to be the absolute, you know, like the threat of closing borders of Hong Kong during the SARS crisis that never actually happened, did happen, and here we are, and happened on a much larger scale at the time. You know, it's also, as we were starting to also like certainly like tell this the political history of Hong Kong post 2003 and post 2013, more and more slides got added, and, you know, they became more and more serious and consequential and heavy. You know, with the different chapters of that ongoing story being written. I think one thing that also, like, we certainly had to revisit was also like that whole politics of quarantine and self-isolation and coming together, because that was indeed seen much more romantically, I think, during SARS in Hong Kong. And again, for reasons that we mentioned, that, you know, because indeed the danger was slightly different, but yes, I think most people did regard the gesture of actually, also because quarantine wasn't imposed. It was more that legally, it was a recommendation, yeah. And you didn't have a figure like, you know, Donald Trump and all the other idiots, you know, fighting against quarantine and wearing masks. So it was simply not an issue. So a position where one could romantically decide to actually, you know, leave the house and come together and symbolically fight the disease and fight the quarantine was possible during SARS, and obviously that would have very different implications now. For you know, people to do that, especially in America. I mean, maybe in Hong Kong now that's possible because of the current state of the epidemics, but probably less advisable in many other places at the moment.
I think that just to bring back a little bit the discussion of like learning from Yellow Pearl discussions, like of course that's an immediate like kind of parallelism, like hatred that is happening in across communities in the US, Canada, Australia again. But there's also, this pandemic has specifically also like resurfaced or surfaced how in our context of globalization and migration and capitalism, there is differences of how people are affected by the epidemics compared from where they're coming from or their ethnicity, and that varies in different places. Like in London, for example, the NHS that is applauded every night and then, there is a huge amount of Filipino nurses in those body counts. And so it's not only like, if you start to specify like who are the people who are actually dying, in what amounts, where are they coming from, what social status they have, what social class do they belong to, what race are they part of. Anyway, it varies from place to place, but this epidemic basically emerges and shows the most evil structures in different parts of society. In Brazil, it's quite clear who are the people who are dying, no? So I think that it's like the xenophobia of the Yellow Pearl. Yes, it's something that it occurs in the parallelism of Asian American context, but it also teaches us on how the hatred and xenophobia is even much, it's affecting all sorts of communities elsewhere, and different structures of how society and capitalism works. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly sort of mention an exhibition that was produced back in 1990 by Vancouver artist Paul Wong, which is called Yellow Peril Reconsidered. I don't know if you guys know this exhibition, but it was quite a groundbreaking exhibition that sort of focused on the artistic and cultural productions of Asian Canadian artists. And it was a national touring exhibition, and it went to Montreal, Winnipeg, Toronto, and different places. But I mean, we're running out of time, but maybe for next time we can talk a little bit about Paul's show, and for anyone who's interested in the participants.
Oh wow!
This is actually Paul mailed this to me. Like,
what is the cover actually?
It's a work by actually I need to find out. Sorry, by J. Hirabayashi. The work is called Rage. It's a exhibition that was really produced and then sort of at the peak of the Asian Canadian cultural politics, and the show included 25 Asian Canadian artists. It was quite a phenomenon actually. back in the day. And this show still influenced a lot of the Asian Canadian studies, let's say, scholars and students these days. So I thought I would just give it a shout out.
Nice, thank you. I would like to know more about this. If you can actually send us.
Yes, there's actually a website. So I would definitely.
It showed me, just came to me because we did another show that was about many things, but we showed the work of Richard Fong, who is a Chinese Canadian filmmaker and a queer.
Who was in this show?
Oh, great! So yeah, so we showed a beautiful film called Chinese Characters. This kind of like montage on race, desire, and
here.
Yay, that one, we showed it. Wow.
Yeah, it's somehow I thought it was Dirty Laundry. There was another work, but anyway, so definitely I will share more information. And I also Alice in our chat is also actually I guess Alice also introduced this show to me back in the day, so I want to give a shout out to Alice as well. And yeah.
Good.
And, I just have a comment.
Really like to see the PDF. If there's a way to send it, would be wonderful.
Yes, actually, if you guys just Google Yellow Peril Reconsidered, and then there should be a website that's called On Edge TV, and then there should be an address for it. But I can definitely follow up with everyone who's interested, and also Inti and Cosmin with the link, and then there will be more information. There's also the essays that produce as part of the catalog.
Oh my God, thank you everyone who stayed for so long.
Sorry,
yeah.
Thank you so much, Inti and Cosmin, for this very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. And it was so great to know more about the project, a journal of the plague year, and how its different iterations kind of like speak to different contexts and the additions to that when it traveled. I just wanted to, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I just do some quickly closing the event. I also want to mention today the talk is the first part of Triangulations by Pacific Crossings. We have two more coming up. So the part two is a talk with Beijing-based curators Carol Yinghua Lu and Liu Ding. The talk is called Let Individuals Represent Individuals. And the talk would be, we also publish a written response by Toronto-based curator Su-Ying Li, who's also at the talk tonight. So through Carol and also Liu Ding's daily conversations and their contributions to letters against separation on the efflux conversations, they have had a chance to reflect on the impact of COVID-19, not just on the everyday life in a practical way, but on their conception of the existing orders of organization that condition our daily lives. And the third part is dispatches from Manila, an online screening of short video works selected by Lost Frames, short stories by an unnamed artist, and an interview between Alison Collins, Mayumi Hirano, and Mark Salvatus. And dispatches from Manila ask artists and curators from the region to check in, offering the perspectives or creative projects that have been occupied with during the recent months. And Metro Manila has been in lockdown since early March 2020, when measures to restrict movement were taken to prevent the spread of the disease. With the COVID crisis unfolding among its citizens, governing officials have used the pandemic as a pretenses to impose military and police enforcement around the capital region, inciting fear through forms of restriction that echo previous eras of forced civic containment under martial law. And this project will be online in July.
And stay tuned for Charlotte Zhang's response to tonight's discussion. So. Yeah, thanks again, you guys, and thanks again to everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And then also shout out to people who join us also from Asia. It's so great to see different people joining from different time zones. And that is, I guess, literally Pacific crossings.
Yeah, and looking forward to reading the response as well from Charlotte. So thank you for that as well.
Awesome. Yeah. See you guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
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 Bye. Oh, Allison.